Suspended.
Without objection.
Many bills get introduced in the Senate and they don't seem to go anyplace. The reason is that they're meant to be simply messaging documents, making a statement, telling people what you believe, not necessarily the motive of passing a piece of legislation. Now, I usually do not care to comment on these bills. It's simply not worth the time. But when I see the combination of false information spread in messaging bills that could negatively impact my state, I must set the record straight, and that's why I'm here. Several colleagues just introduced a bill to repeal the renewable fuel standard. I've been a proud advocate for renewable energy. Iowa is the leader in both wind and renewable fuels. When it comes to the renewable fuel standard, it is hard to argue that there has ever been a more successful clean fuel policy implemented across the world. Between 2008 and 2020, the use of biofuels under the renewable fuel standard resulted in a savings of 980 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's the equivalent of removing over 200 million cars from the road for 1 year. The renewable fuel standard makes gasoline more affordable. It generates good-paying jobs. It reduces oil imports and reduces our country's greenhouse gas emissions. The messaging comes from the bill. The messaging coming from the bill rehashes the same talking points about ethanol that big oil has trotted out for the past decades. So once again, big oil raises its ugly head. Of course, big oil's talking points have been completely debunked by the latest science and even our nonpartisan research from the Congressional Budget Office. And Congress depends a great deal upon the research done by the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan group of professional people that study things a long time before they release their information. Now, my pro-oil colleagues say that the renewable fuel standard causes food and feed prices to rise. However, in 2014, the CBO looked at this issue and the impact on food prices if renewable fuel standard was fully repealed. The Congressional Budget Office concluded that American food prices would be just 1/4% higher if the renewable fuel standard was kept in place versus total repeal. Out of a $100 grocery bill, the impact is no more than a quarter. But when you consider that there is a savings of $5 every time you fill up your gas tank due to the renewable fuel standard, consumers save money overall with the renewable fuel standard in place. My colleagues that introduced this messaging legislation also claimed falsely that corn ethanol achieves little to no reduction in greenhouse gases. Now, this must be the most ridiculous assertion made against ethanol. I'd like to invite my colleagues to visit Iowa to see how far ethanol has come in reducing emissions. The most recent research from Harvard shows that corn ethanol greenhouse gas emissions are 46% lower than gasoline. Research by the U.S. Department of Agriculture found the reduction in CO2 could reach 71% by next year if farmers follow best practices. At a time when the nation is working to reduce fossil fuel consumption and protect our environment, why would my colleagues introduce a bill that would increase our dependence upon foreign oil and at the same time increase greenhouse gas emissions? And some of these people on this bill have the most pure environmental record in the United States Senate. Renewable fuels like ethanol have a 40-year track record of making fuel more affordable and vehicles more efficient. To limit this consumer choice at the pump is completely irresponsible. Attempts to limit consumer choice, which are driven by big oil interest, that must be defeated. The United States should continue to build on the progress of the renewable fuel standard and bring policy to the table that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and brings jobs to rural America. Let me end with a history of the IRS, because this legislation is a story of irony if you consider how we got to the renewable fuel standard in the first place. You see, big oil wanted it. Why did they want it? Well, a lot of states where they had smog had what we call the oxygenate requirement. It was required in the Clean Air Acts that Congress has passed over the decades. So in order to meet that standard, big oil would add what they call MTBE, a product made out of petroleum that they added to their gasoline to meet the oxygenate standards, to reduce smog. So, after a long period of time, people realized that the MTBE was poisoning groundwater in California, maybe other places as well, but I remember mostly the conflict being in California. And they were being sued. So by 2005, Big Oil decided they didn't want to be sued. And what could they do to get out of it? Well, the RFS was the answer. So I was chairman of the Finance Committee at the time. They came to us with the ideas of the RFS, and it fit into a lot of things that we from agricultural interests were trying to accomplish as well. So the renewable fuel standard was written in cooperation with Big Oil, the first time in 3 decades that Big Oil had any interest in working with the ethanol industry. And then what, after 3 or 4 years of working with us, they've been attacking the RFS since then. And this piece of the legislation I'm speaking about today is just one more example of Big Oil trying to attack ethanol. And I gave all the facts about ethanol being good for the consumer, good for the environment, and good for less reliance on foreign countries for our energy sources. In fact, everything about ethanol is good, good, good. I yield the floor.